All right, 1 Corinthians chapter 7. We're jumping right in. If you have your Bibles, you can flip there. We're going to jump around the chapter quite a bit. And this is a long chapter with a lot of great stuff in it, but it's kind of challenging to tackle, if I'm being honest with you, because it's about singleness, it's about sex, it's about divorce. There's a list of things that are in the midst of this chapter, and I'll say I kind of struggled as to whether or not this is is this going to be a PG-13 or not. I'll probably put the rating at about a PG-10. I think there's not specific details. It's not very detailed, and I think you should be fine. But if you have your kids in here and you're not comfortable with this topic or conversation, this might come as a surprise to you, but we have a kids department right down the hall, and they're not talking about sex and singleness this morning. So if you want to take your kids, now would be a good time to go ahead and do that. If you remember Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, this really isn't as much a composed work of theology as it is really a response to these questions that the church has. And so what's taking place here is Paul is receiving these letters from the Corinthian church, and he's then writing a response to their letters. You're going to see that in verse 1 of 1 Corinthians chapter 7, and it's going to be similar to what we talked about a couple of weeks ago in 1 Corinthians 6. Now, today we're going to focus, even though we're going to kind of jump around to all of the different scriptures, we're going to really focus on singleness today. And you say, well, that's kind of odd because we're predominantly a church that is couples, is families. And you say, well, why do we need to discuss this? Well, because we're a church of predominantly couples and families. And maybe there's a reason that singles don't feel comfortable here. We do have single people in our church. Crazy, right? We actually have more than you realize. And so today is for them. And in the coming weeks, we're going to talk about divorce. We're going to talk about being unequally yoked. We're going to talk about sex in the marriage. We're going to have lots of fun on Mother's Day. I'm not single, so I don't have a lot of experience in singleness. And so today's message, I've not really spent a large part of my life researching and studying the Bible's view of singleness. And so this morning's message, I've got lots of help. You're going to hear quotes from John Piper. You're going to hear quotes from Rebecca McLaughlin. You're going to hear quotes. You're going to hear a lot of help from J.D. Greer. There's just a lot of information that I'm pulling from for this message today, and I just like to acknowledge that because I'm certainly not an expert in this, but everything that I'm sharing with you, I believe 100%. And so I believe as a church we have this beautiful privilege and obligation, really, to view singleness in Christianity as highly, highly important. So, verse 1, chapter 7, now for the matters you wrote about, and then in quotes, it is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman. And you could be reading that, and if you don't pay attention to the quotes, you could be wondering, what in the world? Like I thought we heard a couple of weeks ago that sex is good. Sex should happen. Like why now is it saying it is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman? But the quotes are very, very important because what he's doing here is Paul is quoting a statement that the church has made to him. Right? So those quotes are like, okay, you guys have said that it is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman. Let me set the record straight here. Paul's saying, I understand that's what you're saying. Let me help you understand why that's not true. Because apparently there was a group in the Corinthian church who, probably in response to the sexual promiscuity that was going on in the city and in the church, now all of a sudden is saying absolute celibacy is the way to go. Sex is bad, and at worst, or at best, a necessary evil. The true, holy Jesus people are no sex people. Bad. And Paul is like, not really. That's not, like, we don't have to swing the pendulum all the way over there. Christianity has this incredibly high view of both marriage and singleness. And so Paul in this chapter is talking about how marriage and singleness are both gifts and that God has a plan for both. But here's our dilemma. We live in a church culture that is absolutely obsessed with marriage. Like, that's the goal for everybody. Like, in other words, marriage, varsity. Singleness, JV. That's the view of Christian culture is, listen, if you get married, you've made it. You've arrived. You're on the varsity squad. If you don't get married, well, there's probably something wrong with you. You're not good enough. You're on the JV team. And a lot of times in the church, single people often feel marginalized. I heard of one church group that called their adult social group Pairs and Spares. As if single people were spares. That's terrible. On the other hand, we live in a secular culture that is obsessed with singleness. Not biblical singleness, mind you, which means that you remain celibate, but a no-commitment singleness where you can have sex whenever and whoever and however you want. That it's convenient with no strings attached. Since 1960, the percentage of adults in our country who are married has dropped from 72% down to 50%. And the age of men and women in their first marriage has risen all the way. For men, it's 30, probably moving straight out of their mom's basement into marriage. And then down here to 28 for women. 28 and a half, actually, is the statistic. And so Paul wants to show you that God's plan is for both marriage and singleness. And he begins championing the goodness of sex within marriage. And so we're going to touch on that a little bit, but we're going to go into that more later. But he says this, but since sexual immorality is occurring, each man should have sexual relations with his own wife and each woman with her own husband. Translation, sex is a good desire. It is a God-given desire. And through it, God gives us a beautiful illustration of the gospel, and it's his way of propagating the species on earth. He created marriage. He created sex. He created sex to be had in the confines of marriage. And we discussed that a couple weeks ago. We established that it is good, that God made marriage, God made sex. He made those things before sin entered this world. He called them good. It is good. And therefore, Paul is saying it's okay, but it should be in the confines of your spouse. Verse 3 says this, the husband should fulfill his marital duty to his wife, and likewise the wife to her husband. The wife does not have authority over her own body, but yields it to her husband. How many of you women in the room are just, I don't know. He's going there. Now, I want you to understand, this would have made total sense to the Corinthian man. It was just assumed that in that time, The wife was the man's sexual servant to fulfill his desires. But here's what Paul does. He doesn't just stop there. He throws a total curveball at him, and he says this: in the same way, the husband does not have authority over his body, but yields it to his wife. And the women are like, it's a good thing he finished that. That statement would have blown the Corinthian men's minds. They would have been like, what? They had sexual mastery over their wives. They could divorce her for any reason, right? Didn't like the roast she made, done. Like, it didn't matter. Like, you could divorce your wife for any and every reason. And now Paul is saying to the husband, you should see yourself as a servant as well. And Paul is overturning this whole culture, this whole system that's taking place in Corinth. And he's saying, no. This isn't just that. It's this, that we are servants of one another. And in marriage, both offer their body in service to the other. And by the way, sometimes these verses get pulled out of context, like there's some kind of sexual trump card that spouses play on the other and say, hey, I want to have sex, and Paul says I have the authority over your body, so you can't say no without sinning. That is not what Paul is trying to say here. And if you've ever used that as a trump card, shame on you. Shame on you for using something that is so sacred and so important to use that against your spouse. The sexual relationship is a lot more complicated than just simply those two statements that Paul gives us. Paul is simply saying that in marriage, both partners should see themselves as the servant of the other. And he says in verse 5, do not deprive each other except perhaps by mutual consent and for a time, so that you may devote yourselves to prayer. Then come together again so that Satan will not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. And so Paul completely debunks the idea that celibacy is some sort of spiritually superior state. He's commanding married people, so if you're married in this room, he's commanding married people, get after it. It's fine. And some of you are like, this is the best message that I've ever heard. And some of you are like, oh, great. I won't tell you which ones of those people you are. But Paul takes a turn. This is what he says. He says, I say this as a concession, not as a command. In verse 7, he says, I wish that all of you were as I am. And what is he? Single. He said, I wish you all were single. But each of you has your own gift from God. One has the gift, this gift, another has that. The word for gift there that he is using is the word charisma. And it's one of the words that's used in the context of spiritual gift. Paul says, marriage is good and it is a gift, but I'm single, and guess what? That is good and it is also a gift. And he says, and I actually wish more of you had that gift. But wait, Paul, isn't it necessary for us as human beings to find that special someone and to get married and to have sex with them in order to fully feel alive? Paul's like, no, that's not it at all. In fact, the most fulfilled person to ever walk this earth was a 33-year-old single male who remained sexually celibate all of his life. So, now to the unmarried and the widows, I say, and unmarried and widows means that he is talking to people who are single for whatever reason. They're single because the right person hasn't come along. They're single because they're single again. Maybe they were married and now they're single. Maybe their spouse died, spouse left, spouse divorced them, whatever the case. Maybe you proposed and they rejected you. Whatever reason you find yourself, Paul says, for those who are single, he says, it is good for them to stay unmarried, as I do. So let me just give you a handful of completely countercultural statements on sex, singleness, and our culture that is gleaned from this chapter. Number one, singleness is not inferior to marriage. Single people get a really bum deal about this because married people in the church seem to always be trying to fix them up, right? As if there's something wrong with them. Oh, that's so sad. Let me help you find someone for your life. I have a friend who's single in his late 40s, and he said he just gets tired of going to weddings and the little old ladies coming up to him and saying to him, oh, it's okay, you're next. And so he's just decided that now when he sees those same little old ladies at funerals, he's like, it's okay, you're next. And sometimes we talk like the reason people are single is because they're not mature enough for marriage yet, right? And I know that that's not true because some of the most immature, dysfunctional people that I know are married men. Can I get an amen for that one? Maybe not if they're sitting next to you. But we say things like this: as soon as you are satisfied in God alone, then He'll bring someone into your life, as if we earn God's blessing by achieving some spiritual Jedi state that allows then the right person to come into our life. I'm saying some things that single people are like, it's about time. Or God just has to do a little bit of work in you before He brings you that special someone. You have to become someone wonderful before God gives you someone wonderful in your life. As though God grants marriage as a reward to the satisfactorily sanctified. Tim Keller says it like this: under all of these statements is the premise that a single life is and in parentheses, a second-class life, a state of deprivation for people not yet fully formed for marriage. These statements simply are not true. And that's because marriage is not some superior state. That's because marriage is not varsity and singleness is JV. In fact, any marriage is just a temporary gift that God gives to you as a fulfillment of His purposes. Look at what Paul says in verse 29. What I mean, brothers and sisters, is that the time is short. From now on, those who have wives should live as if they do not. How many people have taken that out of context? Right? Some people read that verse and think, what in the world? Paul's telling men who have wives to live as though they don't have wives. That's like the patron verse of people going to Vegas. Like, yeah, we can go to Vegas and live as though we don't have wives. That's not what he means. Please hear me say that today. He explains in verse 31, he says, for this world in its present form is what? Is passing away. And along with it, marriage. Marriage is this temporary gift. Both married and single people should realize that their situations are not the ultimate. Both marriage and singleness are temporary gifts for the fulfillment of God's purposes. Throughout the gospel, Jesus said the most fascinating things about marriage. There was this one time in Mark where there's a woman who she had 7 husbands because her husbands all kept dying. And whenever I read that passage of Scripture, I just think to myself, does anybody asking questions? Like, the first husband dies, and they're like, oh, that is so sad. I'm so, so sorry. And then the second husband dies, and we're like, wow, that's super, super unfortunate. And man, as a community, let's come alongside of her and help her. And then the third one dies, and people are like, huh. And then 4 more husbands die. Nobody's saying, there's a problem here. Like, what are you feeding him? What are you putting in his soup or his hummus or whatever he's eating? Like, I'm asking those questions when I read stories like that. They're just saying, hey, in heaven, whose wife will she be? And they're probably all thinking, none of them. I mean, I don't know. I'm just saying, like, I don't know how they died, but I would have lots of concerns. Notice, finally, the 8th guy was like, like, I'm staying away from her. I know how that ends. So they asked Jesus, like, whose wife is she going to be in heaven? And this is what Jesus said. He says, well, you are wrong in your premise. There is no marriage in heaven. There's no marriage in heaven. Marriage was a temporary illustration of the love of God. And temporary means by which God populated the earth. It was a good gift, but it will soon give way to the relationship to which it pointed. And for some of you in the room, and some of you watching online, there's probably some of you that did not know that. And this is the first time you're hearing that you're going to get to heaven, and you're going to be like, you look really familiar. I recognize you. Right? Like, I don't know how all that works in heaven and all of that. I don't get all of that. I don't understand it. I can't explain it. I just know what Jesus is saying is that really marriage and relationships are not going to be the same there as they are here. It goes on, and earlier in that chapter, or a few chapters before that, actually, Jesus had been teaching, and somebody called out, Jesus, your mother and brothers are here to see you. And Jesus looks around and said, here are my mother and here are my brothers. Like they're here. For whoever does the will of God, he is my brother and sister and mother. And it's Jesus really kind of reiterating this idea that relationships in church are even more binding than the biological ones. How cool to be blood related to Jesus. This is how John Piper says it. He says, God promises you blessings in the age to come that are better than the blessings of marriage and children. Marriage is temporary, but what it stands for lasts forever. Marriage is a temporary institution that finally gives way to the relationship to which it was pointing all along. Christ and the church, at which point marriage fades away and it becomes unnecessary, the way you no longer need a picture of someone when you finally see them face to face. That's how Rebecca McLaughlin says it. At its best, marriage and sex are like gateway drugs that point us to a far more fulfilling relationship. So again, we come back to 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 29. What I mean, this is Paul, what I mean, brothers and sisters, is that the time is short. From now on, those who have wives should live as if they do not. Both married people and single people should realize that their situations are not ultimate. Both marriage and singleness are temporary gifts. They are light and momentary gifts, the word says, for the fulfillment of God's purposes in this life. Which leads me to number 2. The gifts of marriage and singleness both have their advantages. Marriage is a gift. To state the obvious, it was God who looked at man by himself and said, this is not good. He says he needs help. It's not good that a man should be alone, so I'll make a helper for him. And the book of Genesis says that God fashioned a woman. The first word used to describe this, I butchered it first service. Somebody corrected me who actually is a Hebrew student. It's the first words to describe the woman was Ezer Kenegdo, which in Hebrew means basically same but different. She was made in the image of God, just like him, same, but she was made different from him, a complement to him, that they complemented one another, that they were different because they needed to be. And even though every person is an individual, there are general patterns to men and women that go back all the way to when they were created. Listen, I want you to hear me because I'm going to make some blanket statements about like generalizations about men and women, and I recognize that everybody is unique and everybody's different. Maybe now would be a good time to plug this coming Thursday, Friday, and Saturday. We have a class that's called Unique that I get to teach, and it's discovering how God has wired you and made you in all of your uniqueness, all of the things, the complexities of how you were made, and then discovering the purpose that he's made you for. So if you are interested in that, we would love to have you come be a part of that. It's free. There's no cost. We're going to feed you. We're going to take care of kids. Like, it's going to happen. So if you're interested, you can go, not right now, but after service, you can go online and register for that. So I'm going to make some generalizations, and I want to be careful because I know it's not always the same. But many women, and I'm going to say many, not most, many women are more nurturing, and thus better to create a stable home environment. Like many men, I was not good at creating a home environment. It's not that I'm terrible at it. I think I have some fashion sense, but for most guys, myself included, when I was first thinking about marriage, I was thinking my dream home was going to include the waterbed that I grew up in. It's like, sweet, it's a waterbed, it's awesome, right? How many of you ever had a waterbed growing up, right? They don't have them anymore. I don't think they exist anymore. My dad used to work for a company called Waterbed Warehouse, super unique name. Guess what they sold? Waterbeds. And so he sold, and so our whole family had waterbeds. And they were really great until they weren't, until some kid jumps onto your bed with a pencil and starts stabbing the waterbed with a pencil. And then it's a problem. But in my mind, waterbed, couch, leather couch, big screen TV, surround system, that's all I needed. That was my idea of making a home. Before I got married, you could move all of my stuff into my Subaru Justy hatchback in 15 minutes. On the way to college, I get to college, I unpack it. Turns out the comforter thing that you put on your bed is supposed to be washed. I didn't know this. And so I don't think mine got washed in 4 years of college. And I'm just being vulnerable with you guys. If you can't handle that this morning, then you need to relax. But I got married. And so now it would take us like a full-size SUV to get the throw blankets out of our living room. Like, we have so many throw blankets, like a whole U-Haul just to get pillows from my bed out the door. It's a whole thing. And not everybody's like that, but God made the man and woman complementary so that the two of them together would be a more complete reflection of the image of God. And it is a gift. And even more importantly, marriage is a gift because it teaches experientially about the love of God. C.S. Lewis compares it to a ray of the sun, a ray which warms our face and makes us look back up along the ray to the God from whom it emanates. Marriage should teach us more about the gospel than anything else. The kindness, the tenderness, the forgiveness, the security, the unconditional love of God. Marriage is a gift. But singleness is also a gift. You say, well, how so? Paul explains it in verse 33. He says, but a married man is concerned about the affairs of this world, how he can please his wife, and his interests are divided. A healthy marriage, friends, takes a lot of time. Sometimes you have to stay up late and work things out. Your wife needs time with you. Your husband needs time. Your kids need time. The flexibility that we once had in our single lives are now focused on the present responsibilities and being present with our family, with those people who matter the most. And people ask me, well, what are your hobbies? And I say, do you mean what were my hobbies? Like, because my hobbies now are my family. And it's not exactly the same now as it used to be, because I'm now, my kids are older and I'm trying to play some golf, and I use that term super loosely. Am I right, Rob? Like, very, very bad. But marriage puts a lot of demands on our money. I have people to take care of. I want to bless those people. I want to take care of them. Being married and having a family is expensive. Right? There are times where we refer to our kids by their nicknames, which is Tesla, Tahoe House in Italy, because that's what they cost. That's a little funny. You guys didn't laugh nearly. I think you think I'm serious about that, actually. We don't really refer to our kids as Tesla. Not today. Someday, maybe. The sacrifice of our time, the sacrifice of our money is a lot. But guess what? It is divinely limited, because these are the responsibilities given to us by God for our wife, for our kids, for our families. And it's not just limiting for the man. Paul says to the woman, verse 34, an unmarried woman or virgin, some translations will say, or the betrothed, the person who's betrothed to a husband, is concerned about the Lord's affairs. Her aim is to be devoted to the Lord in both body and spirit. But a married woman is concerned about the affairs of this world, how she can please her husband. So if you get married and have kids, it affects your career. Husbands or wife. And for many, it might stifle your career altogether. The freedom of a single person to pursue certain things, both recreational or career-wise or spiritually, ministry-wise, those things are very difficult when you are married and have children. So I could say to any of the single ladies listening to this, here in the room, watching online, you get to listen and follow the Holy Spirit on the direction that He has for your life. So much freedom. For a married woman, so much of your ministry is assigned to you. When Kelly and I first moved here in 2007, we were being interviewed by our church council as to whether or not we were going to be the right fit for Lifehouse, and at the time it was a different name. And one of the questions that came up was to my wife. They asked my wife what ministry was she going to be involved in. And both Kelly and I answered that question basically the same way, and it was that Kelly is a full-time missionary to the unreached people group known as the Coffee Kids. And they are a mean tribe. Like, they are hard to get across. Like, that's not an easy assignment. And if you're single, you get to choose in the ministry in which you are engaged in. And now that my children are older and two of them have moved out of the house and one is old enough to be on the worship team and all of that, Kelly is now her ministry. She gets to choose to be in other things where she gets to lead worship on Sunday mornings, and we're grateful for that. But at the end of the day, as a single woman or even as a single man, you get to determine the ministry that you're a part of. So it's no wonder that Paul says, I wish that all people were as I am, single. There would be so much more extra bandwidth in the church for ministry. He goes on in verse 35, I am saying this for your own good, not to restrict you, because this is what people hear. They hear rules and restriction. He says, but that you may live in a right way in undivided devotion to the Lord. That is the right way, undivided devotion to the Lord. He says, I'm not trying to put rules and regulations on. My agenda for you is to live in a right way, in undivided devotion to Jesus. distracted, unrestricted devotion to Jesus. And listen, friends, whether you're married or you're single, that is ultimately the goal, isn't it? Number 3, considerations for the question, should I get married? Because maybe you're here this morning thinking, I don't know if I want to get married. I mean, it sounds complicated, and it is. But here's some questions you should ask yourself. The first is, do I have the gift? And that's the million-dollar question. How do you know if you have the gift? Well, first, realize that most people have a wrong conception of spiritual gifts. They assume that a spiritual gift is some kind of lifelong assignment that God stamps on you and until you leave for heaven, like a personality trait, as though it's something that you have to live with for the rest of your life. We're going to talk more about that when we get to 1 Corinthians 12, 13, and 14. We'll talk all about spiritual gifts, right? But a spiritual gift, a charisma, to use the Greek word for it, is a special empowerment that comes to you for a time, for some spiritual assignment, or for specific circumstances and reasons. And all of us, by the way, were single at one time, which means all of us for a time had the gift of singleness. For those students in the room, we've got some of our youth students in the room. This is a gift. You have the gift of singleness, and you will have the gift of singleness until you're 40. No, I'm just kidding. I'm not speaking that. You don't look within and then mystically see if you've got the singleness. Don't make it complicated, Paul says. If you're single, guess what? You have the gift of singleness, at least for the moment. You say, well, how do I know? Because you're single. And God will empower you to do it well. And if you are married, you have the gift of marriage. And you can know that because you're married. Even if you felt like it was a mistake, you have that gift now. And God will give you the spiritual gifts to do it well. You say, well, I'm single now, but wondering if marriage is a gift God is planning to give me in the future. How can I tell? Paul gives us a clue. Verse 9. For it is better to marry than to be aflame, to burn with passion. Paul says, if as you pray about it, your desires to be married burn inside of you, it's okay to ask God for a spouse to meet those needs. But it could be that in praying about it, God answers the prayer by giving you the ability to control yourself without marriage. Or it might take away the desire to be married. Other desires begin to grow in your heart. There are some who have prayed about getting married because they thought that's what good Christian people do. Like I want to be on the varsity team, and so I'm going to pray, God, give me a spouse. But the more they prayed about it, the less desire they had to be married. And the more their passion for ministry and the things of God grew. And they said they always felt guilty about that, but like there was something wrong with them because they weren't pursuing and desiring that. But then they read this chapter and realize that Paul is actually saying, no, singleness is a gift. He describes himself like this in verse 37, but whoever is firmly established in his heart, being under no necessity, but having his desire under control, he will do well. Firmly established, under no necessity, having his desires under control. Is that you? If so, you probably have the gift of singleness, at least for the time being. And so you should take advantage of that. If you're not like that, maybe ask God for a spouse. Paul's like, listen, this isn't mystical. This is like between you and God, and you need to be praying about that. You need to be asking him about that. And he's kind of flippant about it. Verse 36, if any man feels he should marry, he can do what he wants. Verse 39, but if a wife's husband dies, she is free to be married to anyone she wants, but she is happier if she remains as she is, in my opinion. Not my opinion, Paul's opinion, just so we're clear. I'm not making opinions today. The translation is, don't make this hard. Pray about it. Let God lead you through the desires and trust that where he leads you, he will give you the gifts and the empowerment to do it. And I'm just going to say one thing. I didn't say it for service, but just for the sake of offending everybody this morning. Parents, stop talking to your single children as though they have not arrived or they are not successful if they are not married. It's really, really damaging, because that equates that something is wrong with them, or they're not spiritual enough, or they're not good enough. And I just want to say that is nonsense. It's nonsense. All right. B, is it the right time? This is a really interesting verse in this chapter that really confuses people, but when you understand it in its context, it makes a lot of sense. In verse 26, it says, I think that in view of the present distress, it is good for a person to remain as he is. He goes on to say, if you are married, stay married. If you're single, remain single, stay single. And at first, it sounds like Paul is kind of encouraging these people, listen, the single life, that's where it's at. Don't pursue marriage. And we could take that out of context and say, okay, nobody get married, everybody stay single, this is the celibate life. No, you have to understand what he's saying here. He's saying that in view of what? In view of the present distress. Christians during this time of Corinth were some of the most persecuted people on the planet. Persecution was at an all-time high. Christian families were being torn apart. They were being sold into slavery. And it's difficult to go through persecution as a single person, let alone as a married person. And so what he's telling them is, listen, in light of the current circumstances of persecution and all of that's happening in this world, you might just hold off on the marriage thing. That would be like if somebody came to me on a Sunday morning and said, Pastor Ryan, God is calling me to the Middle East, to an unreached people group that's predominantly Muslim, that is radicalized in their country, and saying, I'm supposed to go and minister to them, but I got to get a wife first. No, because there's a really good chance you're going to be persecuted, you're going to be beaten, even killed. You don't want to take someone else into that. If God's called you to that, amen, you can go and be a part of that in your singleness. But do not drag a poor woman into that situation, or vice versa. And you say, well, does that exist? Absolutely it exists. But in our country today, we could say for now, at least for now, I'm not making any statements, but right now, we're not being persecuted. I know we can say, well, they're trying to persecute this and that and that. Yeah, I get all those things, and I understand that. I don't make light of those things. But we're gathering as Christians in this room freely. For now, we get to do that. And so right now, we're not being persecuted in such a way that if you were to pursue marriage, that the government's going to come and rip you apart and kill you, or, like that. That's not the case here. So if Paul was writing this letter to us today, it would say, hey, under the current circumstances, get married. Go for it. Does that make sense? All right. Well, I didn't give you time to respond, so hopefully it does. Here's what it means for us. There can be situations and times in our life that make it more advantageous for you to wait. I'll give you some examples in our cultural context, in a season where you're trying to finish your education, in a time where you're trying to figure out your career and your life, or maybe God has called you to focus on a missions focus like I talked about. So maybe those are times in your life where it's not quite ready, or maybe you need time to heal from something. During those seasons where it's wise for you to wait, and you can trust God that He's going to give you the spiritual gift to wait. C, the third thing is, when it's time, don't wait. I like what Paul says in verse 36, but in the New Living Translation, but if a man thinks that he's treating his fiancée improperly and will inevitably give into his passion, let him marry her as he wishes. It's not a sin. It says, but whatever you do, in verse 37, be firmly established. So let me just follow Paul's lead here and talk to the men that might be single in the room or might be watching online. Let me just say this, be firmly established. Are you going to marry her or not? Don't be a jerk. Don't flirt with her. Don't lead her on. Don't pretend like you have interests when your interests are really not to get married at all. You say, well, I'm just trying to figure it out. No, you're not. You're leading her on. You're being cruel. You're keeping her close enough to enjoy her without having to commit anything to her. It's the opposite of Jesus-like love. You're taking and not giving. And I would just say, stop it. Stop it. If there's a girl you want to ask out, ask her out. Don't be that guy that's like, oh, look, it's funny, we just keep ending up in the same places together. Right? There's this like whole subculture in our society right now, like called sneak-a-date or the friend-ationship. I don't even know how to say these words. Do you guys know this? Friend-ationship? Where it's like, yeah, whatever. I don't claim to know it, but it's like you show up in the same places. And you're like, oh, look, you're here. And, oh, like you pretend like you're boyfriend and girlfriend. You're pretending like you're dating, but doesn't involve any sort of risk and potential awkwardness. If you're a guy in that situation, stop it. Be a man. Be firmly established. If you're a woman in that situation, stop it too, because you're just leading him on. If you're engaged, and this is going to hurt some people maybe, don't keep a ring on her finger with an elusive promise of marriage way out there. Either marry her or don't. Don't string her along. Be firmly established. And guys, if you know it's not time for you to get married, be firmly established and don't lead her on and break it off. Get on with what God is doing in your singleness. And girls too, don't lead the guy on. Dating is a road that leads to marriage, and if you're not ready to get on that road, don't. Guys, in case you misunderstand me, I'm not saying that you need to move quickly and drop the marriage card on the first date. That's not what I'm talking about here. Like being firmly established should never be confused with creepiness. And if she says no, respect that. Hounding a girl after she says no and then playing the God card and saying, well, God told me to ask you out, is not the way to the blessing of God. It's actually the way to being slapped with a restraining order. This is what happens. So be wise. Number 4, reject the eHarmony myth. There's nothing wrong with the eHarmony per se, but the myth is that you can find the perfect person, that if you could just find the perfect person, you will be happy. And if you're unhappy right now, finding the perfect person will fix all of that. And if you're married and unhappy right now, it's because you married the wrong person. But here's the truth. Romance and marriage will never satisfy the deepest needs of your soul. I believe this 100%. I see it all of the time. But for most single guys, it's kind of like they're drowning in a sea of loneliness, insecurity, boredom, despair, and problems like loneliness and unhappiness. Here's the hard reality. Lonely, unhappy single people become lonely, unhappy married people. And I'll let you in on a little secret this morning, just because I want to offend everybody. You always marry the wrong person. You say, what? First of all, the person you married, they're a sinner. In fact, the person that you were so infatuated with, so in love with, the person that you could do no wrong was so bad that Jesus had to go to the cross and die for that person. Like shed actual blood. because that person you married is so terrible. So, pretty soon, you're going to figure out what those things are that Jesus had to go to the cross for. And if he had to go to the cross for those things, my guess is they're going to probably be at worst or at best mildly frustrating. I mean, if something was so messed up it took Jesus' blood to fix it, don't you think it's going to cause some problems in the relationship? Second, psychologists say that even in a lifelong monogamous marriage, we are married to at least 5 different people because they change. So, and some of them change often. So if you married the right person at the beginning, guess what? They're going to change, and soon they're not the right person. They're a different person. And the eHarmony myth is that happiness in marriage depends on finding the perfect person, and it leads to terrible captivity. Because you're terrified that you will never find the right person, and if you're married, you're terrified that you married the wrong one. So many times I hear people in marriages say, I'm unhappy in my marriage because I married the wrong person. You're unhappy in your marriage because you don't understand marriage. Number 5, never settle. Verse 39 tells you to marry, but only in the Lord. If you get married, you should only do it in the Lord. Translation, you cannot and should not marry a non-Christian. So, shocker, you should not date a non-Christian. Because why on earth would you lead each other on when it literally can't work out? It's kind of cruel if you think about it. So for the students in our rooms, those who are single, yeah, I'm talking to you girls, and everybody else, but mainly the 3 of you, that you should not be dating a non-Christian. It's never going to work out. If you are a Christ follower, it's a non-negotiable, right? Yes. Let me talk to you ladies for a second, not just you ladies. The guy that you marry is going to be the biggest influence on your children. Don't settle for a guy who won't lead them spiritually. Just about any married person will tell you it is better to be single than to be married to someone who doesn't share the core values and belief systems that you have. And I know if you're sitting here and you're not a Christian, you might be feeling like, dang, I'm being kind of mean. And I'm not being mean by saying that you're not good enough for them. I'm just being practical for your sake. Because if you're here and you're not a Christian, and you're here because a Christian brought you here, it could be a man or a woman, they brought you here to church, they brought you here to convert you. That's how this works. I see it all of the time. They want you to become a Christian. And I know you can sit there saying, this is awkward and weird. Yeah, but you are here because that person sitting next to you wants you to become a Christian. And even more, their whole family is praying for you. Their mom and dad are fasting and hoping that you become a Christian, and nobody in the family is ever going to be really happy until you become one. And if you're not a Christian and have no intention of becoming one, do you really want to marry into a situation where no one is going to be happy with you? I'm just being honest this morning. I'm being most honest today. And if you're currently married to an unbeliever, and I know I'm kind of joking around, but we have people in our church, I know many people who are married to an unbeliever. They found their faith after marriage, and now are Christ followers and are in a marriage that is not equally yoked as the scriptures talk about. And And I get that, and it is hard. And I have so much empathy for you in this season of your life. The Bible talks about this specifically, that scenario and situation. The Bible talks about it. We'll talk about it. It might be on Mother's Day, but we're going to talk about it. So here we go, and let me close this. I'm going way too long today. Bring it all the way back around to where we started. Marriage and singleness are gifts. Temporary gifts for the fulfillment of God's purpose in your life. If you're looking for something to satisfy the deep needs of your soul, it's not going to be found in marriage or a new marriage or a new relationship. You're going to find it in Jesus and his love for you. You say, but I don't want to be alone right now. I'm tired of being alone. You're not supposed to be alone. God created you for relationships. He created you for companionship, and the ultimate place for you to find both of those things is in the context of a faith community. Again, remember this statement, marriage is temporary, but what it stands for lasts forever. Christ and the church, at which point marriage fades away. Singleness fades away. It becomes unnecessary the way you no longer need a picture of someone when you finally see him face to face. Rebecca McLaughlin said this. She said, "You won't wither without sex. You will wither without friend and family connection." And that's available in the context of faith communities. So invest deeply. Invest into the church, invest into relationships in this context. And church, we have a responsibility to singles, the people that aren't here because they don't feel comfortable, they feel marginalized, they don't feel like they belong here. We have a responsibility to invite them into our families, into our community, into our lives. First of all, see them as treasures that Paul sees them. Don't treat them like a project that you need to fix or set up. But be aware of their particular calling has some particular challenges. So invite them into your family experience and relationships there. Invite them to join you in key moments. Invite them to do things other than just come babysit your kids or help you move. And all the single people said, amen, I like this guy. We've had single friends come with us on vacation, do Thanksgiving and holidays with us. Invite them into your life. We are not the best at this, but we're working hard to be better at it. And then finally, singles, the greatest predictor of if a child will continue their faith is 5 adult relationships in the church outside of their parents. If you don't have kids, be that for some other kids here. Get involved in their lives. Could be formal, could be in Lifehouse Youth Ministry, could be informal, could be down our kids' hall. If you want to know where to find someone or to make yourself look as though you are marriage material, serve down the kids' hall. Let them know that you like kids. You can hold babies without being weird. Let's pray before I get myself in any more trouble.